Eric Rakestraw. I'm a partner in Husch Blackwell's intellectual property practice. Before we begin the presentation today, I'd like to cover a few housekeeping items. At the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit them via the question box. We will try to answer all questions that we receive during the webcast today, but if a fuller answer is needed or if we run out of time, we will have a copy of your question and we'll follow up later via email. A PDF of the presentation is available in the Program Materials folder. This program has been approved for legal education hours. To report your hours, click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webcast that you can watch and share later. Towards the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We will use your feedback to plan future programs that are applicable to your business needs. I'd also like to point out that we're going to have a few audience participation poll questions for you today, which are going to come up periodically during our presentation. These are required for, I believe, Kansas CLE credit, but we're going to encourage everyone to participate, even if you've never been to Kansas, because I think you're going to find the results interesting. That's all I have for the housekeeping items, so let's get started.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Mindy Giftis, and I'm a partner at Husch Blackwell. My colleague, Eric, who just opened the program, as he mentioned, is also a partner. And Eric and I routinely advise companies on timely intellectual property and various technology issues. And a couple of months ago, we were talking to one another about some very interesting issues that we had been dealing with on open source on behalf of our clients. And we thought it would be fun to launch a webinar series on open source software in the event other people would be interested in some of these same topics as well. Our first webinar a couple of months ago was a general primer on open source. We talked generally about the philosophies behind the different types of open source movements. We talked at a high level about the types of licenses that often come with open source software, and we issue spotted a lot of other topics that tend to come up with use of open source software. Following that primer, we requested our audience to provide feedback on topics that you want to hear more about. And one of the top topics that came up out of that was cybersecurity. So today, what we want to do is dig right into cybersecurity issues, both generally and with respect to use of open source software specifically. We find that it tends to be helpful to talk about the current cyber risk landscape, anytime that we discuss cybersecurity, because this is an area that's constantly evolving. We've all heard about the Colonial Pipeline, the SolarWinds attacks. Really, we hear on the media, mainstream media, all of the time about massive attacks that are taking place. Frankly, many of us have become accustomed to hearing about these major attacks. But when you really start drilling down into what's happening and what some of the numbers are and trends are out there, it truly is alarming. The sophistication of attacks is up. The number of attacks is up. The severity of attacks is up. The costs involved with attacks is up. And unfortunately, it has become easier than ever for threat actors to gain access to tools needed to engage in these attacks. So I wanted to share a few statistics with you. From March 2021 through February 2022, AV Test reported that 153 million new ransomware samples had been identified. In 2019, 93.6% of malware that was observed was polymorphic. And what that means is that it has the ability to constantly change its own code in order to avoid detection. Almost 50% of company computers and 53% of personal computers that get infected are attacked within the same year or re-attacked within the same year. This statistic I found somewhat alarming. There was a 2007 study that found that there was an attack on systems every 39 seconds. Recently, the Internet Crime Complaint Center, which is run by the FBI, ran a 2020 report, which found that successful cybersecurity attacks were taking place every 1.12 seconds. That's not the number of attempted attacks, that's successful attacks. So clearly, we're talking about a very prolific problem. The last statistic I'll provide to you is that Cyber Edge Group recently reported its cyber threat defense report. And of the organizations it had surveyed, 86.2% reported that they had been the victim of a successful cyber attack. So this is something that's impacting every organization. It's growing in scale. And it's also one of the trends that we're seeing in the industry is it's also, largely growing in scale to the extent that threat actors are often trying to hit multiple targets at one time. I recently, in the last couple of years, assisted an organization that ended up having a cyber attack that impacted 400 different entities all in one foul swoop. And it was ransomware. Everyone was shut down. It was a huge, huge nightmare. So with that background and landscape, what happens when an incident occurs? And often organizations really don't fully appreciate what happens in the wake of a security incident unless and until it actually happens to them. While the nature and severity of incidents can vary widely, every cybersecurity incident has a lot going on and requires significant attention. When a breach occurs, there's always an initial rush to understand what happened, what is the scope of the incident, how do we contain it? Sometimes that's easy to do. Sometimes companies are able to get into their systems, find the root cause, and shut it down. Other times that can be more difficult, as when scripts change, or in the event of a ransomware attack, companies may be locked out of their entire systems for a long period of time, and then they're confronted with the choice of either paying large ransomware to obtain decryption keys that may or may not work, or rely on backups to restore data. So there's significant events, there is a lot going on, and there are many requirements that may come into play. As shown on the prior list, one of the requirements following a data breach is providing notifications to impacted individuals and regulatory agencies. There are many applicable laws and regulations that apply in the event of a security incident, and they can vary by industry, but most of these laws and regulations have been around for many, many years. There's nothing really new about this. The one thing that we wanted to point out to you that is shifting and that is more new lately is that there's much more of a heightened focus on cybersecurity now by many government agencies. This is in large part in thanks to the Colonial Pipeline incident, but as well as many other incidents. The government is becoming much more concerned about national defense, shutting down systems. I'm sure anyone that's paying attention to the Biden administration, they're speaking out on cybersecurity all of the time. And this palpable shift is important to become aware of, because now when incidents occurs, these government agencies are becoming much more proactive, much more involved. There's much more of a expectation, if not always a requirement, for notifications. And by way of an example, I was recently assisting a client with a data breach that they had, and I received a call somewhat out of the blue from a person who identified himself as a special agent from the United States Air Force. And he wanted information about the incident because somebody within his office had found my client's data on the dark web. And I told him, I said, I have to admit to you that I'm somewhat taken aback, because I've handled a lot of data breaches over a lot of years, and I've dealt with a lot of law enforcement, the FBI, Secret Service, local law enforcement, but I've never received a call from a special agent at the United States Air Force. And, he said to me, that's because it's very new. There's a new focus. They're being much more proactive. And in that particular answer I gave you, the organization that had been impacted was a defense contractor. So it's very interesting to see that this is really starting to shift. The other shift that I wanted to discuss is attitudes by businesses. You know, ever since breaches started happening, when it becomes public knowledge that an organization suffers a data breach, oftentimes business partners, vendors, suppliers want to know more about it, most particularly because they want to know whether their information or systems might have been implicated as well. What I'm seeing in the last couple of years is business partners are being much more proactive and pushy in this area, even if, you know, we can clearly tell them that their systems or information was not impacted, because they want to know what's going on. They want to sit down and say, tell us more detail on what happened, what software it came through, what tools it was used or whatnot, so they can strengthen their own systems and their own security posture. In my view, this is great because, as we've run through already, cybercrime has become such a major threat in the US and throughout the world that educating ourselves and communicating across industry sectors really is a key to combating this problem, or at least making some meaningful impact toward that goal. So this is, you know, one reason that why Eric and I are thrilled that you're here today, so that we can talk more about the specific threats relating to this topic when it comes to open source. Because especially with open source software, there are a lot of areas that are frankly largely overlooked.
Agreed. And that, Mindy, that brings us to our first sort of audience participation poll question today. Please take a minute and answer and pick the option that best describes your organization's industry. And what I suspect we're going to see here is that we have viewers from across all of these industries. Cybersecurity is not just limited to, it's not something that only technology companies need to deal with. It affects all of us in equal measure. Give you guys just a few more seconds here. Yeah. Any surprises there, Mindy?
No, you're right. Everyone's covered. It looks like we have technology, manufacturing, and transportation leading the way.
Yeah.
But we do have coverage from everyone.
Yeah.
So with that, and thank you everyone for participating in the poll. Now that we've covered the overall risk landscape, we can dive into the OSS considerations that fall within that. First, you know, our agenda is we're going to discuss some of the specific vulnerabilities that arise with open source and why. We'll then discuss examples of two major cyber incidents that have involved open source software, including the highly publicized Log4j vulnerability, which recently posed risk to many, if not most companies in 2021 and 22. And then we'll close by discussing some best practices and recommendations, if you will, for managing cyber risk with open source software. So of course, open source has many of the same security risks and vulnerabilities as commercial and proprietary software. It's the same type of software, it's the same type of tools. There's nothing unique in that. The major difference is that open source software is not monitored or patched to the same extent that commercial software is. If you think of commercial software, let's say, for example, a Microsoft product, Microsoft is constantly updating its software, it's constantly assessing vulnerabilities, and if a vulnerability is found, it will develop a patch and it'll immediately send it out to all of its licensed users. That doesn't happen with open source software because there are so many different contributors to open source, and it's something that's continuously built upon. Security is often overlooked. So there's nobody that's going to send out a specific update to you saying, hey, there's a security risk, you need to apply this patch. Instead, software teams that use open source software have to be proactive about their own security. They need to know what open source software is used and know where they can actively seek out where vulnerabilities may be identified and where patches and other tools or updates may be found. It's interesting because vulnerabilities in open source software are made public by contributors themselves, There are also a couple of organizations like the Open Web Application Security Project, OWASP, and the National Vulnerability Database, which will provide information on known vulnerabilities that are out there. You know, this is great news as it provides open source users with valuable information on vulnerabilities. However, it's a double-edged sword because it's also a resource for threat actors who can go look at it, quickly find where vulnerabilities are, and then leverage them to their advantage. So if companies are behind the threat actors, it can pose more of a threat than you traditionally run into with commercial software. So it's very important that companies are up to date with what risks are publicly disclosed. It is also important to note that open source software licenses don't contain a requirement for security. So when different developers are adding on or building or testing the software tool or library or whatever it may be, they're not necessarily thinking about cybersecurity. I do think that that's beginning to change in the last couple of years, but companies need to be very careful about what open source applications they're using and whether contributors and or developers have taken security into mind when developing it. A great example of a data breach that's taken place that we'll discuss a little bit further as we go along is the 2017 Equifax breach. And I feel confident that every person on this call was compromised in that data breach as it impacted something like 143 million Americans. Following that incident, Equifax acknowledged that the breach was caused by its failure to patch a vulnerability in the Apache Struts component, which is an open source web application framework used for developing Java web applications. So the threat is very real. It's not that open source is just used in very small niche applications. Every company, large and small, is generally utilizing open source these days. It is interesting because many companies that I talk to say, well, we used to just say no open source, we're just not going to do it. But that's just not really realistic anymore. So it's very important to be aware of these issues. And despite the widely known Equifax breach, and that was almost 5 years ago now, there hasn't been a whole lot of urgency in the open source community to address cybersecurity until, as I mentioned, quite recently. And some recent statistics show that vulnerabilities in open source software can often go undetected and undisclosed for up to 4 years before they hit these publicly identified lists that I just mentioned. The good news is this is changing, and the more people are talking about it and the more people are identifying this risk, we're hopeful that number will go down relatively drastically. But again, the takeaway is this is very different than the landscape for commercial software. So it's very important for companies to be aware of what open source components they're using so that they can be proactive on security, finding vulnerabilities, and security updates.
And Mindy, I would add here that there is a spectrum of sort of open source software projects in terms of how seriously they take security and how quickly vulnerabilities are patched. So for something extremely high profile like the Linux kernel or Mozilla Firefox or any of the sort of big name open source projects, they're generally doing a very good job and things are getting patched very quickly. And as you go sort of further down that long tail, it can get dicey really, really quickly, as we're going to talk about.
Absolutely.
So I sort of titled this the open source security life cycle. What I want to do is just kind of run through the way that a security vulnerability will unfold. Because I think that a lot of attorneys in particular don't have a lot of insight into this in terms of how it actually happens on the ground. And so what I put up here is kind of the ideal case where you have maybe a friendly security researcher or maybe someone who's on the team who's actually developing this software is the first one to notice that there is a security issue. Okay? And in that case, the issue can be fixed, which typically means that you're going to have a new version of the open source software component released. before the security issue is known to the general public or to bad actors. Now, when that happens, in some sense, that is a public disclosure of the vulnerability, right? Because in open source, when you update your software and you post your new version to GitHub, right? There's a message there that says, hey, I fixed X, Y, and Z, right? And maybe only a software developer knows how to go and look for that. But that's quickly going to get picked up on if it's a big, project by the technical press. And then if it's big enough, it could blow up to full-scale media coverage, as we've seen happen many times. And so sticking with the ideal case, what you would have is as soon as that becomes public and someone says, hey, there's a new version of this open source software component, you would see vulnerable applications and devices getting updated right away. And hopefully that happens before bad actors get around to actually exploiting the vulnerability. And so even in this ideal case, the takeaway should be that there's still a race, right? After step 3 happens and there's a disclosure that, hey, there's a new version of this open source software component that has fixed a security vulnerability. I mean, that is a sign to bad actors that they're going to try to start exploiting that right away. And so you still, even in the ideal situation, have to move very quickly to make sure that your organization gets those patches and updates pushed out. Here's a more common series of events, which is that it's not a friendly researcher, it's a bad actor who first discovers a security flaw. What you typically have in this case is it's being exploited in the wild before anyone even associated with the open source software project knows of the vulnerability. This is what the technical press and people in the industry often refer to as a 0-day vulnerability, if you've heard that terminology. What happens often is someone will pick up on, hey, there are systems that are getting attacked. We don't know exactly how or what the root cause is. And then it's discovered, oh, these systems all have this particular open source component installed. And then now you have media coverage, and the project itself is rushing to try to fix this vulnerability as quickly as possible. Even after that's done, now you're having to move on to, once that vulnerability has been fixed in the upstream open source project, you've got to push that patch software out to all of your applications and devices, which can be a complicated process. We're going to move on to some specific examples in a minute with the Equifax breach and Log4j. But before we do that, I just want to touch on one more point that in my experience can be surprising to many attorneys. And that is that the most widely used open source software projects are, generally speaking, not applications in and of themselves. They are more basic building blocks that are then incorporated into other applications. That can be other open source software applications, but it can be actually many proprietary applications. Applications you've contracted with a vendor to write for you are very, very often going to include open source software components. And so when you have an application like that, and a security vulnerability is discovered in one of those open source software building blocks, it adds additional steps to this process of getting that vulnerability patched and addressed. You're going to have at least 3 parties involved. You're going to have the upstream open source software project, you're going to have the application developer, and then you're going to have your organization. Most of the time, and actually in my experience, the open source software project, particularly big or widely used ones, they're going to be the fastest step. They're going to address the vulnerability on their end relatively quickly. Where you run into trouble is when the ball gets passed first to the developer of the application. They have to pull in a new version of that open source software component, do whatever testing, additional development work is needed to make sure that it's going to fit in cleanly with the rest of their application. And then they're going to have to release a new version, which then passes the baton to your organization to grab that new version of the application and get it deployed. We're going to touch on this a little bit later, but this is something you need to be thinking about when you're negotiating software agreements. You want to have language in there to ensure that if there is a vulnerability in an open source component that's being incorporated into that software, that the vendor is going to make sure that gets patched and distributed to you in a timely manner. And then on your own side, you have to make sure that your organization has the right systems and policies in place to take that patched application and get it deployed as quickly as possible. All right, this is our second audience participation poll questions for the day. Has your organization implemented an open source software policy? And I would say if you are aware of any form of OSS policy, I would answer yes to this one. And I'm interested to see what the results are here. Give you guys a few more moments. All right, 30% of you said yes, which I think is around what I would have expected. And I also am not surprised that the largest proportion of you don't know. I think this is a rapidly evolving area. And I think one of the main takeaways that we want you guys to have today is that this is something that is important and is worth paying attention to. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Minnie to get us started on some examples of some high-profile recent breaches involving open source software.
Absolutely. And at the beginning of our discussion, I mentioned Equifax, and I also mentioned it is 5 years old. So you may be saying, why are we still focusing on Equifax? But it really bears discussing and reviewing, because it really is the largest data breach of personal and financial information in American history. The breach, as I mentioned, impacted 143 or 147 million people. And through the breach, very highly sensitive information was stolen. Most of us, our social security numbers and all sorts of other information was stolen, given that Equifax is a credit reporting company, of course. I sometimes joke with my clients when in the aftermath of a breach that involves social security numbers, because I say, don't worry, because of Equifax, that was already out there. But of course, it's not funny. And it was a huge incident. And, you know, the incident, as I mentioned, was through Apache Struts. That was a widely used tool by companies of every size, Fortune 100 companies, every sector you can think of. And it was used to build different corporate websites and apps. And it frankly still is commonly used today. I don't think to the same degree. But at that time, everybody was using this tool. And while it was many companies were using this tool, many of the organizations that were using it really didn't have good visibility into the software, the development, the security, whether vulnerabilities existed. And at the time that the breach occurs, the vulnerability that allowed for the incident had been known, and it had been disclosed, and a patch for it had been available for months before the threat actors exploited the vulnerability. So going back to Eric's description of, you know, the ideal way to find vulnerabilities and disclose them, that was the case in Equifax. It's just, unfortunately, Equifax wasn't on top of it. And, you know, I'll give Equifax credit and say I'm quite sure they are on top of those things right now. But unfortunately, that is how that vulnerability happened and the breach occurred. And, you know, it's easy to point the finger at Equifax after the fact. Many people have, and they've paid dearly for it. But the reality is that many companies have ineffective open source software security policies and management. And I'd be interested to know, in that poll that we just looked at, how many of those companies that said, yes, there is a policy, meant that in the context of the IT department and not in the context maybe of the whole company or the IT department in conjunction with the legal department. And I know a lot of companies struggle with that. But, you know, it's a real struggle, but it's something that many companies are actively dealing with. So that, you know, continuing with Equifax, you know, and why does it matter and why is it a good example too? It's estimated to have cost Equifax upwards of $2 billion And the number I saw from that is more than 2 years old, 2 or a year and a half old. So it could potentially be more. But the incident not only harmed their reputation and required them to go through all sorts of regulatory requirements, it resulted in years of high-profile government investigations, class action litigation. There's currently, if you go to the Federal Trade Commission's website, people can still submit claims for this because there's over a $425 million consumer judgment. So it's interesting. There were a number of federal agencies involved, all 50 states and other territories involved. So it was a big deal. And as I mentioned, payouts are still taking place. The final settlement wasn't even approved until January 2020, I believe. And I believe claims can still be filed through 2024. So right. Equifax is going to be feeling the pain from this incident for a couple more years, even though we're talking about an incident that took place almost 5 years ago. So with that, Eric, do you want to jump into Log4j?
Yeah, absolutely. So Log4j is obviously a much more recent breach, and we're going to get into that. But first, I wanted to start with a primer of just what exactly is Log4j. And the answer is it's one of these open source software sort of building blocks that is incorporated into just an extremely wide variety of devices and applications. Basically anything that runs the Java programming language, which is one of the most common programming languages, particularly in enterprise environments, is going to use Log4j to implement basic logging functionality. It's released under an open source license, Apache 2.0, so it's permissively licensed, which means that it can be incorporated into both open source and proprietary software. And a personal anecdote here is that I discovered that my fancy Wi-Fi system that I have at home apparently uses Log4j internally, because I noticed that in early January, there was like an urgent update that I needed to apply, and it was documented as fixing the Log4j vulnerability. And so was I thinking about Log4j in the context of my home Wi-Fi? Absolutely not. But that just goes to show you how widely distributed this is, and what a big problem it's going to be to try to clean up. So it seems like it's been longer than this, but the first security vulnerability related to Log4j was identified in early December. The vulnerability itself is called Log4Shell, which you may have seen in some media coverage. And it essentially allows an attacker to remotely gain control of any device that is using Log4j. And we're talking about hundreds of millions of devices at least at this point. This vulnerability is extremely severe. Jen Easterly called it one of the most serious vulnerabilities she'd ever seen in her career, which, coming from the head of U.S. cybersecurity and intelligence, it is quite a statement. Ubiquitous and easy to exploit is a very, very bad combination. And from everything I've read, this does not require a high level of skill or resources to exploit whatsoever. Early media coverage of this, as I'm sure we've all seen, was apocalyptic, essentially. This is from the Washington Post, most serious security breach ever. And this was one of the tamer ones to come out just before Christmas. And I think, honestly, it's unfortunately probably going to live up to this level of hype. So if you look at it from a technical perspective, Log4j itself, the open source software project, it was fixed very quickly. They had an initial fix the same day, December 6th. Subsequent to that, there was some kind of additional related vulnerabilities that were identified kind of along the same lines, and those got fixed on December 12th. But of course, that's not the end of the story. Where we're at now is all of the applications and all of the devices that incorporate Log4j, they have to be updated to include the latest version. And then updated versions of those applications have to be installed and pushed out to affected devices. For IoT, for Internet of Things devices, this is going to be particularly difficult because many of those don't automatically install updates. Either the user has to install updates and users don't know that they need to do that, or in some cases, updates are not even possible. And so we may have for years and decades into the future, security cameras and IP phones and printers and who knows what else that are going to remain vulnerable to this. So where are we at now? In January 3rd of this year, Microsoft's security team wrote that they expect this is just going to be a very long process. We're already starting to see, at least according to Microsoft, state-sponsored attacks that are exploiting this vulnerability. As of this month, it shows no sign of abating. The FTC has weighed in on this recently, and I wanted to make everyone aware of this statement. The FTC has authority to address cybersecurity breaches under the FTC Act. And they were a major part of the Equifax settlement was with the FTC to settle that litigation. And this blog post I read is basically putting organizations on notice that the standard under the FTC Act is reasonableness. And they're saying that you have a duty to take reasonable steps to actively address Log4j. And to the extent that companies fail to do that, it looks virtually certain that the FTC is going to take action. And so, with that.
So can I
yeah,
give a comment before we move on to our next poll? One thing that I would like to just mention here is, one, we are not by any stretch of the imagination saying that companies shouldn't use open source. In fact, open source tools are often extremely, well, they're much better than coming up with your own software or finding other commercially available alternatives. Often open source is the most vetted software in the industry, and it can be excellent, which is why it is so ubiquitous. But I also want to note that when we talk about, potential liability or, investigations relating to these types of things, because this landscape is always changing, the threshold that we always want to look at and to meet as companies is, are we being reasonable? Are we taking reasonable steps to protect cybersecurity? And that's a spectrum that's constantly changing because vulnerabilities are constantly changing. And what one company may be able to implement with respect to cybersecurity and open source management and whatnot is not always going to be the same as what an Equifax or another company can do. So when you do look at how to manage all of this, how to review all this, these threats are going to keep coming. They're not going to end. But when you're evaluating, is it worth it? Is it not worth it? Usually it's yes, it's often yes, and we're going to give you some best practices soon. But you really also want to say, what can we do to credibly be able to say that we are taking reasonable steps to ensure that we are protecting ourselves and our constituents from a cybersecurity level. And in addition to the Federal Trade Commission, every state has it's usually built within a data breach notification law, but every state has laws, or most states have laws requiring companies to implement reasonable security measures and whatnot. So just wanted to underline that the key here is, taking reasonable measures when dealing with all of this.
Yep. And just to elaborate on something you said, Mindy, closed sourced and proprietary software has all of these same issues. You don't hear about them as much because the nature of open source software is that all of the discussion about it and all of the fixes, that all happens in the public space. And so I don't know that you could even conclude that there's more vulnerabilities in open source software. It's just that we know about all of them.
Exactly.
All right, so this is I believe our final audience participation question today. Does your organization have a cybersecurity breach response plan in place? Give you guys a few more minutes. Right. That's good.
It's great.
Yeah.
This audience gets a gold star for 77.5%. And that's actually very, very good. Despite, the prolific nature of cyber threats and whatnot, a lot of companies still just haven't quite gotten there. I think that is also going to continue to change because, going back to some of the statistics we talked about, and 82% of companies being hit with some sort of security incident is a high number. So it is very good to have a cybersecurity breach response in place, and also to test them and to update them regularly. But well done, audience. So jumping to some of the best practices, we're really going to go through both best practices from open source generally. That's what this slide is. This isn't necessarily only relating to cybersecurity, but when dealing with open source software at all, it's always a good idea to understand what open source components are we using and why, what licenses apply, and what are the basics of those license terms. We can't get into it in depth in this presentation because there's simply not enough time. But as Eric mentioned, some licenses are very permissive, and that means that you can use the open source components very broadly, and there's not a lot of restriction on it. You can use it internally, you can use it externally with consumer-facing software. You can do a lot of things with it. There's also much less permissive licensing that can have some very significant restrictions that might limit your ability to use it in commercially available software that you provide to your own customers. It might have different requirements depending on whether your application is a SaaS application or on-prem application. So there's a lot that can go into these different licenses. Some of these licenses can conflict with one another. So it's really important to get your hands around not only what you're using, what your use case is, and what the licenses say, but whether you're complying with those licenses. To do this, we highly recommend creating an open source software policy. I already alluded to it a little bit previously, but that's got to include both folks from the IT team that have a really good understanding of how open source is used, what the use cases are, what other software is involved, but also with risk management and legal, so that there's a process in place to make sure that there's some oversight there, and there's an approval process, and there's also a process where if a vulnerability is identified or a component is deemed problematic, that there's a process to be able to remove that or update it. Similar to that, the policy needs to be implemented at all levels of development. It's really important that the IT department has it and understands it. But if only somebody at a management level understands it and isn't pushing it down and providing the training to other people and developers that are working on this, you can run into some real problems. It's very important for the legal team to have training on what all of this means, because when Eric and I were talking about this a few months ago and came up with this idea, we were laughing at ourselves about it because we're geeks. I mean, nobody cares about this stuff except very special people like us, so a lot of people, this isn't common knowledge, and it can be very confusing. And so it's good to make sure that, risk management, legal, has the basics of why this is important, what it means, and what the company's strategy is. Because, as you all know, every company's risk tolerance level varies. Some companies have very little to no risk adversity. Some have a lot more. So it's good to understand that. And then again, it's very important to conduct audits and keep records of what open source components you're using. One of the starting points of looking at all of this is figuring out what open source software is used. And that can be very difficult if we're talking about going back in time to find what somebody might have put in a software application 5 years ago. There are third-party software tools that help with this type of thing, but it certainly is a bit of a process. As I mentioned to you, I already told you some of these things, but for creating the open source policy, make sure it involves IT and legal, identify acceptable parameters of what types of open source software are permitted and some are not. Only use open source software from reputable sources. Companies can specifically identify, these are the sites that we will allow you to even consider for evaluation of use. Others, we don't have the risk tolerance for that. Most open source software available has been tested, it's been rated. You can look for components and you can direct your teams to look for components that only have been rated as stable within the community and have been vetted and ranked. It's important for implementing a process for vetting open source software. That can be tricky depending on how large your IT department is or how much you're outsourcing to others. As I've mentioned a couple of times, it's really important to understand what the use case is for the open source before you use it, because again, using it in a consumer-facing program might have very different requirements or implications than if you're using it internally. When going through the vetting process, it's important to see what support is available. As Eric mentioned, there are some widely used and very well-known open source components, and you can find those are supported in an extraordinarily well and robust way. Others are not. So it's important that whoever's looking into this looks into that. And then, of course, ensure that you're tracking what you have so that you have somebody that's paying attention to these vulnerability lists that we've talked about and the availability of patches and seeing when updates are available. So Eric, do you want to hit software development internally? Well, it looks like he might have had a quick technical issue here. So Eric is back.
Yeah,
okay.
I fixed it.
Very good.
Yeah. So here I want to talk just very briefly about how you would apply this policy or the ideas we've been talking about when you're developing software for use internally. In my experience, most software, in 2022 that's developed for internal use is going to incorporate open source software components. It's just going to accelerate your development and the quality of your software so far beyond what you could do writing everything from scratch that you're always going to see it. If there's one thing that I would recommend when you're thinking about this process, is maintain a log of the open source software components that you are using, preferably including the version of the software that you pulled in. And if you do that, and you have someone in your organization who is monitoring for vulnerabilities in those open source software components, then you're going to be ahead of the game. You're going to know when a vulnerability is identified. And ideally, you're going to have a plan in place to update those components in a timely manner, preferably on a continuous basis if your process allows for that. But at the very least, pushing out updates whenever there's a security issue that's been identified and then fixed in the upstream software. In terms of negotiating agreements with software vendors, we mentioned this earlier, don't use open source software is absolutely not the takeaway that we want to give you here. It's more about understanding the risks that are involved and making sure that you're using it responsibly and that you have a well thought through plan in place. Things that I typically advise when negotiating software agreements, ensure that if a vendor wants to use open source software, and 99% of the time they do, just have a disclosure of it. Have that list. It can be a full-on sort of software bill of materials, if you guys have heard that phrase thrown around before, or something less formal. But we want to know what is being used so that we can ensure that any vulnerabilities are being patched in a timely manner. I typically want to have laid out a process in place so that the client can approve or disapprove the use of individual open source software components. And you want to have processes that are in place in the event that a vendor is compromised and it impacts your systems. Thinking through all that on the front end is going to save you a lot of headache after the fact. In general, wanting to make sure that that vendors are adhering to the applicable open source software license terms. That's something that Mindy and I covered in depth in our last webinar. But just very briefly, different open source licenses allow use under different circumstances. And so not every open source license is going to be compatible with a given, closed source, application or to be combined with other open source components. There's a lot of complexity there, and you want to make sure that you are aware of that. And including standard reps and warranties. I know this can be a contested issue. My view is that vendors should understand the open source software components that they're using well enough that they can provide the same reps and warranties for those components as for the code that they've written themselves. And it's not in opposition to using open source software. It's just more of an insistence that the vendor understand what it is that they're using and that they can provide the same reps and warranties that they would otherwise.
Yeah, and I would just comment that, this can be a very nuanced area. If you can get a vendor to agree that they'll take responsibility for any open source that they include in any software they develop for you, you don't have to go through a vetting process usually and whatnot because they've agreed to take on, to do the vetting themselves. It's just a lot of times software developers don't want to do that, and they'll put it on the company to say, you're acknowledging that we might use open source, and then it goes back to you as the company saying, well, wait a minute, we don't know what you're using or what those terms are. And so it can have a lot of back and forth, and sometimes those considerations are needed, sometimes they aren't, but a lot of times that's overlooked entirely. So it's a really important thing to issue spot when you are having third-party software development taking place.
I totally agree, Mindy. We'll run through this relatively quickly since we're a little bit short on time. With respect to business transactions, when there's software that's being acquired or that is being used in the target business, again, requesting a list of the open source software that is included in the applications or that is being used by that company. I have the phrase software bill of materials up here, that there's like a specific standard for how a software bill of materials is laid out. I'm not saying it needs to be, that specific, but you want to know what open source is being used so that you can evaluate whether it's being used correctly and in a safe way. Reps and warranties for title, ownership, and OSS license compliance. That's a big one. And then if necessary, you can negotiate an indemnification or a holdback if you think there's a substantial risk in place. On the seller's side, it's always good practice to know before you're going into your transaction, am I using any open source software components, right? You don't want to be scrambling to figure this out during the due diligence window. So have that open source software inventory ready. These are things that you should be doing anyway, right? Just having a list of what it is that you're using. And then documentation, and the more detail you can provide about how that software was incorporated. Architecture flowcharts showing where the components sit within the structure of the application, development logs, seeing where it was, where and when it was pulled in and what version. All of this is going to benefit you greatly later on if you are involved in a transaction like this.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I've seen a lot of deals where suddenly this comes up and neither side is really sure what to do with it, especially it can be from a cybersecurity posture too. So I think that's important. Cybersecurity insurance is also important to evaluate when you're looking at open source. The reality is many companies do have cyber liability insurance today, but not all cyber liability insurance is created equally. And one of the things that we see far too often, in my view, is denial of coverage for cybersecurity incidents. So if your company is using a lot of open source software and there is a higher risk there, make sure that whatever that risk is covered by your insurance, because these insurance policies are very specific usually to whether they are going to apply to incidents on your system, incidents on third-party systems, the types of systems and whatnot. So something to think about when looking at cybersecurity insurance, just to make sure that once you've identified your biggest potential vulnerabilities, that you're covered with that. And just as a side note that I thought was kind of interesting was in talking about Equifax again, their costs with that incident are about $2 billion. They did have cyber liability insurance, but it only covered 125 million. So it's interesting. And to close us out on the topic, I always like to provide just general cybersecurity recommendations because this applies to open source, it applies to everything. But make sure that cybersecurity is top of mind at all levels. And this is really illustrated in what we're talking about today. Make sure it's top of mind when your company is selecting third-party tools to use. It's very important to have that as part of the culture of what people are thinking about when they're vetting these things. Understand the software and systems that your company is using. And based on that, I've mentioned this earlier, identify your worst case scenario. Based on your system, your software, and the data that you process and use, what would be your worst case moment, and plan for that. Devise a breach response plan. Many of you have done that. Make sure you also test it and update it. As we've mentioned several times, this whole landscape evolves so quickly, and threat actors are getting more sophisticated and they're finding new tools. And cybersecurity is not a process. There's never going to be a silver bullet that can be found to fix all of these issues, but treat it as a process. And also work with vendors that excel at cybersecurity. We talked about these agreements and negotiating provisions, and you can negotiate good contract terms all day long, but the best contract you're going to have is a contract with vendors that also take this seriously and also understand it and know it. So those are our overarching recommendations, best practices. We hope you've enjoyed our program so far. We did want to provide a list quickly to you of future webinar topics that Eric and I have both discussed, but also that we've received feedback on from our prior discussion. We'd really love it if during our the follow-up survey, if you let us know, if there's something more that you'd like to learn about, and if you have any other feedback on our presentation today.
Yeah, thank you, Mindy, and thank you everybody for joining us today. Just a few housekeeping items as we close here. As a reminder, this program has been approved for legal education credit. And to report your hours, click on that CEU icon at the bottom of your screen. A certificate of attendance, including course numbers, will be emailed to you tomorrow. And we would really appreciate it if you would complete our short survey. We use that feedback to plan future programs that are most applicable to your interests and your business needs. This concludes our webinar today. Thank you all for attending, and I hope you have a great rest of your afternoon.